I am excited to have Jason join us. He's a good friend of Commerce Next. In addition to his day job as Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at Publicis, he is also half of the team of the Jason and Scott podcast, as he likes to say, the good half. He is a fountain of knowledge about retail and e-commerce trends. This is the third year in a row we've had him do his Cyber Week recap. So, Jason, thanks for joining us, and happy holidays to you.
Happy holidays to you, Scott. I'm going to send you some stuff to add to your Christmas list when you get to Santa.
All right, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. And side note, it's not lost on me. Scott and I started our careers in sort of the same era, and I'm still desperately trying to help sell TVs on Black Friday, and he's just jet setting from holiday party to holiday party for a living. So well played, Scott. And with that, let's jump right into what happened in Cyber Week this year. As Scott mentioned, in the extremely unlikely event that any of you don't get enough of me in the next 20 minutes, there's like 400 more hours of me on the interweb. As Scott alluded, I have a much smarter co-host, Scott Wingo, that many of you would be familiar with. He was the founder of Channel Advisor, and we talk about the kind of issues we're going to talk about today every week on the podcast. And Scott Silverman has been a numerous guest, in fact. So in order to really understand Holiday, it's good to put it in the historical context. And so I do like to remind people of what we all have lived through the last several years. So we're now in the 11th month of 2023. So 2023 is almost in the books. We have the two most important months of the year happening right now. The last full year we had was 2022. And in 2022, we sold $7.1 trillion worth of stuff in the United States of America. That was a nice 8.2% bump from the year before. It was 31% up from the pandemic. And people always ask me, is $7.1 trillion a good number? Like, was that good outcome for 2022? I always like to say it's a freaking amazing number. 2022 capped the greatest 3 years in the history of retail. So ordinarily, retail has grown about 4% a year. In 2022, we grew it, if you take auto and gas out, we still grew it over 7% for that year. We grew 14% the year before. So we're coming off of these 3 amazing years, which makes it somewhat hard to talk about comps and this year versus last year or this year versus 2 years ago. So how are things going this year? Well, from the U.S. Department of Commerce, we have data through October. So we have 10 months of data. And so far, year to date, we sold $5.9 trillion worth of stuff. That's up a very modest amount from these same 10 months last year. So it's up only about 2%. It's up 35% from before the pandemic. And I always like to sort of visualize how these years played out. So this is 2019. This is the normal shape of retail in the U.S. You see that unsurprising spike at the end of the year in November and December as we come into holiday every year. And then the pandemic happened in 2020, and you remember when the NBA canceled its season and we all panicked. You see that huge dip in retail sales that happened that first month there in April. And then we quickly recovered. There was all this discussion at the time. What shape is the recovery going to be? Is it a U? Is it a V? Is it a W? Well, it very clearly was a V. And we actually finished 2020 up a reasonable amount over 2019. So then we came into 2021. We're still mostly locked down. We were all curious to see how things were going to play out after that really anomalous year in 2020. And lo and behold, the greatest year in the history of retail. So it turns out if you lock everyone at home, don't let them spend any money on holidays or travel or vacations, and then you mail $10 trillion to every man, woman, and child in the United States of America, retail sales go wildly up, right? And that's exactly what happened as we sent out all this economic stimulus, as we made it less likely that you would spend in other categories. Retail had this monster year in 2021. And at the end of that year, I probably gave a lot of practitioners on this call advice that this is probably a good time to retire because we're probably going to struggle to comp against this 2021 number. And luckily, very few people ever take my advice because If you remember last year, 2021, we still had healthy growth over that monster number of 2021. So now we're living through 2023, and how's it playing out? I already told you it's much more meager growth. You can see we're tracking very closely to that 2022 number. So we're not seeing the kind of growth we would have even in a traditional pre-pandemic year, much less the accelerated growth we've been accustomed to since the pandemic. And of course, that's retail as a whole. There's always winners and losers. So if we think about the categories that did phenomenally well since the beginning of the pandemic versus the categories that didn't, that top category, what the SIC code calls non-store sales, which is mostly e-commerce, is of course the biggest winner. Restaurant and food did particularly well. Home improvement did well. Things like consumer electronics and apparel and home furnishings did particularly challenging against those industry averages. And if we look at these categories, just how we're doing year to date this year versus last year, you can see even more clear winners and losers. You see those restaurants, you see healthcare, you see e-commerce is still doing very well. Automotive is tracking above the industry average. And you see a lot of the traditional specialty retail categories like sporting goods, consumer electronics, building materials, and apparel have not had a particularly good year in 2022. And obviously when we talk about these numbers, everyone, likes to bring up inflation. It's a super complicated topic. Maybe we'll get into it in the panel. There really is no perfect way to measure inflation. There certainly is no perfect way to adjust any data set for inflation for a variety of reasons I could get into. But I use the best practices that we do have. If we look at the U.S. government CPI index for all consumer goods, inflation in October was up 3.2% year over year. That's not too bad by historical standards. In December of 2019, we were up 2.3%. So inflation has peaked at like 7.5%. So it's come down quite a bit. And if we try to adjust all the retail sales data I just gave you, which would be that dark blue line in this graph, and you say, if I take inflation out of that dark blue line, what does retail growth look like? Well, it looks like that yellow line, right? And what that means is the 2% growth we've seen this year would actually be negative 2.2% without inflation. So we've actually shrunk were it not for inflation. And the 35% growth we've had since the pandemic, more than half of that is attributable to the unusual inflation we've had over the last several years. So if we adjusted it for inflation, we would have only grown 13% in the 4 years since the pandemic. So it's a great story about the top line. It's not a great story for the consumer. It's not a great story in many cases for profitability. And another way I always like to look at this is the U.S. Department of Commerce data is one of the best data sets we have. It's highly flawed. It's surveys. It's government mandated surveys that retailers fill out. And so a better source is actually the retailers' accountants, right? And so the top 10 retailers in the United States of America are all public. They all have to disclose their quarterly earnings. They all have finished their Q3 earnings reports. And I know this chart is a little hard to measure. This is quarterly growth for those top 10 retailers. And then there's an 11th data set in here, which is the U.S. Department of Commerce industry average. And if you look to the far right, which is Q3 2023, you'll see that light blue line, the industry average is at 2%. It's above zero. You'll see two retailers, the largest two retailers in the United States of America, are well above the industry average for growth and have been well above for essentially the whole period since the pandemic, Walmart and Amazon. But look at the other 8 of the 10 biggest retailers in the US. All 8 of them are below zero. They actually shrunk in Q3 of 2023 versus Q3 of 2022. So it's been a very bifurcated holiday. It's a little bit hard to even talk about the industry average because the experience of your Lowe's or Target is very different than the experience of your Amazon or Walmart in this case. But of course, a lot of people on this call are particularly interested in e-commerce, so we break out those numbers. The accurate e-commerce numbers from the U.S. Department of Commerce come a month later than some of the other numbers I've shared, so we only have like the really good numbers for January through September, and in that period, so 3 quarters, we have sold just under $800 billion worth of stuff. That for year to date represents about 15.4% of retail. It's a 9% growth since 2022. And if we look at historically, this gold line is the last 20 years of e-commerce growth, and the gray line is the last 20 years of retail growth. You see sort of traditionally, retail has grown at 4% a year, and e-commerce has grown at almost 15% a year. So if we zoom in on the post-pandemic era, we had this weird inflection point when people got vaccinated, they felt more comfortable going to stores, and e-commerce growth actually dipped below brick and mortar growth for the first time in 30 years. And so that gray line for several quarters was above the gold line. And then the last 3 quarters, we've sort of reverted to traditional patterns. So right now we're at 2% retail growth, 9% e-commerce growth. Both of those growths are a little slow by historic averages, but much more similar to traditional patterns than we saw during the last couple years of the pandemic. A lot of talk about, e-commerce spiked during the pandemic and then shrunk back down. And there's a lot of ways to look at that. I won't get into all the gory details here, but most of those ways of looking at it aren't very valid. What you really want to see is revenue. How many dollars did we collect on e-commerce websites? And this is a graph of exactly that. And so you could see the line went straight up when the pandemic happened, and e-commerce collected a lot more money. And you can actually see the rate of growth after that line is actually steeper than the rate of growth immediately before that line. So if people tell you that e-commerce has kind of spiked and then dipped down in the pandemic, just tell them about this graph in terms of absolute dollars of revenue that goes through e-commerce. So that is kind of the background that sets the table for what I'm calling Swift Christmas 2023, because as you know, Taylor Swift has taken over the world, and she now owns the U.S. economy, and certainly owns the holiday season. For those of you that don't know, she was named Time Magazine Person of the Year today. So when we're talking about holiday, it's really easy to get caught up in the hype. A lot of news articles talk about this being the best Thanksgiving weekend ever. And you really have to take some of those news reports with a grain of salt. Like you may well have seen news clippings like this. News clippings like this come out every single year. We set a record. More people went shopping on Black Friday than ever before, according to the NRF. Adobe says more people spent money on Cyber Monday than ever before. But what you need to remember is, with the exception of 1 quarter, retail has gone up every quarter for 30 consecutive years. So if you don't set a record every holiday, you're really underperforming. So that really isn't a good yardstick. That's not a good bar to measure holiday. So what we really have to say is, what do we historically do for holiday, and are we doing better or worse than we do historically? So another problem we have is everyone has a different definition of holiday. Some people call it November and December. Some people call it November through January. There's a lot of gift card spending. There's a lot of purchases when people make returns in January. So November through January is a common thing. And then in modern times, we've had a lot of early sales in October, and there certainly is a concerted effort to start holiday earlier. We'll talk about that later. But so if we look at that U.S. Department of Commerce data and we take holiday as November through January, on average, we grow 4.4% a year. Last year, we did better than that average. We grew 5.6%. And as you can see, that's 3 years in a row that we did better than that average. So if we're going to have a typical holiday this year, retail needs to grow at 4.4%. We need to set a record by 4.4% more than we did last year. And even that would still be a deceleration from last year's 5.6% growth. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to talk about it. So in that context, let's see some of the data sources that are real time enough to report on sales last week, this week. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is all of these sources are directionally interesting, and I encourage you to keep track of all of them. But they're wildly imperfect for a variety of reasons, right? And you're going to quickly notice that they don't agree. So there's a lot more real-time data on e-commerce than there is brick and mortar retailers, right? So for e-commerce, we have giant panels with millions of users like SimilarWeb and Comcast. We have vendors that serve a huge chunk of the e-commerce community like Adobe and Salesforce. And we have credit card panels that process credit cards like MasterCard and Affinity and others. So Adobe said Black Friday was up 7.5% for e-commerce and Cyber Monday was up 9.6%. And they would say Cyber Monday is the biggest online shopping day of them all. Salesforce disagrees. Salesforce had e-commerce up at 9% on Friday and only 3% on Cyber Monday, which is a pretty big variance. They each have a slightly different definition of retail. They like to measure slightly different things. But this is a bigger variance than we normally see. Last year, there was a little bit of controversy because, again, last year they disagreed on which day was the biggest e-commerce day. But this year we have a bigger delta. But again, if you think about the fact that e-commerce has been growing traditionally at 14%, post-pandemic, we'll call it 9%, 9.1%, very few of these numbers are approaching that 9%. So for e-commerce, this is slightly less than the growth that we saw in October, for example. And then if we look at all brick and mortar, what we get is credit card data. And this year, MasterCard published the credit card data for Friday, but not for Monday. And this is MasterCard's attempt to extrapolate their credit card data to all Americans. So there's some panel bias here. You know, more wealthy people tend to use a credit card more, and MasterCard is factoring that into their forecast. And so they said on Black Friday that spending was up 1.1% for brick and mortar. So that's retail sales without e-commerce was up 1.1%. Last year, brick and mortar without e-commerce was up 1%. So that basically means Black Friday was on par with last year. Not a disaster, but not a phenomenal year by any measure. So those are some of the data points we have on sales. We'll get progressively better data points as we go along. We'll get other credit card panels that are about a month in arrears. Will come out in December for this November data. In mid-December, January, we'll get the U.S. Department of Commerce data for November. And so we'll start getting better snapshots of how this went. But other signals we can look for to see how that holiday went is there are folks like Placer AI and Retail Next that measure in-store traffic, right? And so they actually saw the Thanksgiving week up 1.5% over last year. But last year, retail traffic was up 7% over the previous year. So again, not a stellar number. And again, two of these sources, Placer AI and Retail Next, disagreed on whether traffic was actually up or down this year. I mentioned there are panels like SimilarWeb that can measure traffic on the web. They have over 1 million users that that have instrumented their web browsers, and they use that to predict how much traffic went to all websites. And interestingly, SimilarWeb said that this year traffic to e-commerce sites over the Cyber 5 was actually down 7% from last year. And they actually see traffic down each of the last 3 years. So traffic isn't the same as sales. And what they would say is that there were fewer online shoppers over the holiday period, over the holiday week this year than last year. But the few that did shop this year were more deal seeking and bought more. So we actually had e-commerce growth, although we had traffic decline. So what are some other interesting trends we can suss out of all these data points we just looked at? Well, both Adobe and Salesforce measure discounting, the percentage off that was included in each of those sales. And both reported significantly more sales with a discount this holiday than last year. So we're kind of joking that 40% off is the new 30% off, as we're seeing a lot more of the holiday sales we're at a deeper discount, which obviously has an impact on margins. We can talk about that more. We also are seeing in general people selling cheaper stuff. There's a lot of economic headwinds for the U.S. consumer. Credit card debt is up. Credit default is up. There's a lot of uncertainty about the economy. Wage growth has slowed. And so in this climate, people are looking for less expensive holiday gifts. And so we see that in a lot of the data is people are buying stuff, but they're buying cheaper stuff. They're a lot more private label than we traditionally see, as one example. But another example is that Target publishes a toy catalog every year. And this year, the average selling price of that toy catalog is lower than it's ever been before. And in fact, 2/3 of all the toys that Target has available this holiday season are under $25 because Target is targeting the mindset of the financially cautious consumer this year. And then the other interesting thing that I suspect we'll get to talk about more in the panel is that buy now, pay later services were used significantly more this year than last year. There's a couple data points out there, but Adobe measured that overall buy now, pay later services were used 40% more than last year. Now, part of that's because they're newer services, so they grow faster. Part of that is because they traditionally didn't offer in-store options, and they did this year, so they had a greater access to a higher percentage of total sales. A lot of retailers traditionally used layaway programs for holidays, and those are almost extinct now. I think Scott Sears might be the last retailer that still offers a traditional layaway program. Buy now, pay later has largely replaced that. But there's a lot of implications in the margins that retailers enjoy when consumers spend more on buy now, pay later. There's potentially some cautionary tales when consumers use these kinds of services for purchases that they traditionally wouldn't have financed with a traditional credit card. And one of the interesting ones to me is one of the payment methods that is directly impacted by buy now, pay later are store credit cards. We have a bunch of subject matter experts on this panel on store credit cards, and that's a super important part of the margin mix for retailers. And so if consumers use that service less, that also has an impact on how profitable all these retailers will be for the holiday. So I teased earlier that everybody started their sales earlier. Amazon, of course, has a second Prime Day in October. Most retailers responded to that with their own deals. And so, one of the narratives we always talk about is the flattening of the holiday season, that the spikes aren't as important because now all the days of holiday are important and the holiday is starting earlier. Everyone talks about holiday being November, but isn't it really October now? And while the sales started, the purchasing did not start, right? And so if we just look at October growth every year, on average, October grows about 4.6% a year over year. It's grown more than that the last 3 years, as we talked about. But this year, October only grew 2%. Spending actually slowed down in October in spite of those sales. And the hypothesis is that consumers are really worried about their budgets, they're really worried about the economy, and they're waiting for the very best deals to make purchases. So the spikes actually surprised us a little bit by being a little better this year on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, but kind of at the cost of a lot of this early shopping that we had started to see the last several years. So a couple other interesting trends that I'm watching this year, and then we'll get to the interactive part of the webinar. But I'm calling this digital Christmas. So if you think about what Christmas morning looked like in a lot of households just a few years ago, you had all those kids with the excited toys they're playing with under the tree. And this year the kids aren't even opening their Christmas presents because what they mostly wanted is Roblox and Fortnite gift cards that they're applying to their video game accounts, right? So these virtual gifts have become a much bigger part of the holiday. That's somewhat dissatisfying to grandma who is hoping to see her grandkids play a game. But again, all of these kids have parents who are gamers and actually are aligned with some of these digital purchases. And then of course, families are spending a lot more money on entertainment at the expense of retail. So we've kind of dubbed this funflation, and of course, for a significant segment of the U.S. population, they're saving up for Taylor Swift tickets instead of a Christmas present this year. So the types of gifts that we traditionally get, toys and consumer electronics, are actually seeing a little bit of a decline relative to the rate of growth we would expect to see, and we're seeing a lot more of these alternative things. And then the very last thing I'm going to talk about is there are major new entrants that are having a significant impact on holiday this year. So if you're not tracking them, Temu is now about a year old. They've likely sold over $10 billion of stuff in the US. They really specialize at this point in cross-border trade, so they're selling a lot of inexpensive goods from Asia, primarily from China. And there's lots of controversy around all this, but I can tell you a huge swath of American consumers are embracing Temu and buying these products. And in a climate when consumers are looking for more value-oriented items, Temu is showing up to deliver those items. And so, when you think about the biggest retailers, Amazon and Walmart, disproportionately growing, the new retailers, Shein and Temu, are also disproportionately growing. And so this is really bad news for the traditional retailers that are sort of stuck in the middle. Shein is a little older, but of course pivoted from just apparel to a lot more categories this year, and is really competing with Temu. They filed an IPO earlier this month, so that's going to be really interesting to track. And they, of course, have partnered with some of the struggling traditional apparel brands that are now being consolidated by the mall operators. So, what do Temu, Shein, and Amazon have in common? One thing, none of them have merchants, right? And so you're wondering what the big impact of AI is going to be on commerce. AI impacts a lot of different aspects of commerce, but the one that you need to pay the most attention to is AI is replacing the merchants. All of the most successful retailers this holiday season do not have merchant princes like Nikki Drexler picking the popular items. They're not publishing catalogs of the best toys and having those toys wildly oversell. The biggest, most successful retailers in the world are all using data and AI to decide what to sell and what to offer to each consumer, and that is working very well. So my very last point, the last several years have always had to talk about supply chain. We've had to talk about inventory being low, or potential Teamster strikes, or increased shipping costs, or all of these things. And I'm happy to say that none of those are really a problem this year, that we've really gotten much better at our supply chain. We've diversified our supply chains. We've hardened our supply chains. We've applied a lot more AI to our demand forecasting. So by almost every metric, the supply chain is really dialed in this year. But, fun fact, it's not likely to affect holiday, but guess what we're going to be talking about in Q1 of 2024? Oh yeah, global warming has dried up all the water in Panama, and there's now not enough water to let boats through the Panama Canal. So for those that don't know, the vast majority of goods that reach the United States from Asia come through the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal lets 40 giant boats through every day, and they're now, due to drought, constraining the number of boats. We're at 20 boats a day, which is half of the usual flow, and that's about to go down to 18 boats. If you have goods that you're desperate to get through the Panama Canal and you want to jump to the front of the line, that's a $4 million fee to get your boat in line. And this is likely to only get worse. And so next year, we're likely going to be talking about supply chains getting more expensive, goods getting more expensive to ship as they have to take alternative routes, as the capacity we have in the Panama Canal is constrained. So if you're looking for all good news, you're worried there'd be nothing to be worried about, to talk about over the Christmas dinner table this year, I'm here for you. You're welcome. And those are my big trends for holidays.